He fired me at 5:45 p.m. on a Friday in Manhattan, thinking he just saved his quarter. What he didn't know was that at 6:02 p.m., JP Morgan would freeze $47 million in escrow, and my signature was the only one that could unlock it. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34, Senior Director of Treasury Operations at Halberd Capital Partners, a mid-cap private equity firm headquartered on the 42nd floor of a glass tower on Park Avenue. From my desk, on a clear day, you can see the Chrysler Building catch the afternoon light like a knife. On a Friday in late October, the kind of crisp Manhattan afternoon where the air tastes like espresso and ambition, I had no idea that in exactly 4 hours and 12 minutes, our CEO would fire me in a conference room overlooking the East River. I had been at Halberd for 6 years. I knew where every dollar of our 1.2B AUM lived, which JP Morgan account it slept in, which escrow it was warming up in, which wire was about to leave for Delaware. I knew the cap table the way some people know their own zip code. And I knew Richard Caldwell, our CEO, the way you know a smiling man at a charity gala. Polished, performative, perfectly calibrated to whatever room he walked into. He called me kid in front of the board and Claire sweetheart when he needed a favor. That morning, he needed a favor. He stopped by my desk at 8:47 a.m. with 2 coffees from the Blue Bottle on Bryant Park, the way he always did when he wanted something. "Walk with me," he said. We took the elevator up 2 floors to the executive suite, the one with the floor-to-ceiling glass and the Hudson River bending behind him like a stage curtain. He set a folder on the marble table. A wire transfer authorization. $47,000 from our master treasury account at JPMorgan Chase into an escrow at a smaller regional bank in Wilmington. "Routine restructuring," he said, smiling that white-toothed smile. "I just need your countersignature, Claire. CFO's already cleared it." I opened the folder. The CFO's signature was there. Mark Donovan, neat, mechanical. But the destination account was new. The escrow agent was a name I'd never seen, registered 4 months ago in Delaware. The counterparty box was blank. The legal memo attached was 31 pages of nothing. I'm not a lawyer, but I've been in Treasury long enough to know when a 47 wire is wearing a costume. I told him I needed 24 hours to run it through compliance. His smile didn't move, but his eyes did. Just a flicker, the way a poker player blinks when his card hits. "Take your time," he said, in a voice that meant don't. I went back to my desk. I logged the wire in my private treasury journal, a habit I'd kept since 2019, the kind of habit that made the men on the executive floor laugh and call me the librarian. I pulled the underlying documents from our shared SharePoint. I pulled the bank counterparty list. And then I did something I hadn't done in 6 years at Halberd. I forwarded the entire packet to my personal Gmail at 9:14 a.m. Not because I knew anything, because I felt something. By noon, the floor had a different temperature. Mark Donovan walked past my desk 3 times without making eye contact. Our general counsel, a man named James Whitaker, who usually treated me like furniture, suddenly wanted to know if I'd looked at Richard's file yet. There were 2 closed-door meetings in the corner office that nobody put on the calendar. The receptionist at the front desk, Hannah, who I sometimes had lunch with at the salad place on 47th, leaned over and whispered, "Claire, what's going on? They've called legal twice." I told her I didn't know. It was almost true. At 2:30 p.m., Richard's executive assistant pinged me on Teams. "Richard would like you in the East River room at 5:45. Quick chat. No agenda, no attendees listed." In 6 years at Halberd, quick chat with Richard had only ever meant one thing for other people. I'd just never been the other people before. I spent the next 3 hours doing the most boring thing I've ever done in my professional life. I cleaned. I emptied my desk drawers. I exported my Outlook archive. I downloaded every email I had legitimately authored and every document I had legitimately signed to a personal external drive I kept in my bag. Nothing confidential, nothing privileged, nothing I didn't already have a legal right to as the signatory. I watered the small jade plant on my windowsill. I texted my sister in Boston to say I might be late for our Sunday call. And at 5:43 p.m., I walked into the East River room where Richard Caldwell, CEO of Halberd Capital Partners, was sitting next to Linda Marsh from HR with a folder between them and a smile arranged on his face like a centerpiece. "Claire," he said, We need to talk about culture fit. What he didn't realize, what none of them realized, sitting in that beautiful glass room with the river going gold behind them, was that the 47mm wire he'd tried to push through that morning was sitting in a JPMorgan compliance queue. And the only signature that could release it from that queue was mine. And my phone, on silent in my blazer pocket, was about to start vibrating with a number I'd been quietly cultivating for 11 months. I sat down. I crossed my legs. I smiled back. I had no idea then how badly Richard had just miscalculated. But I was about to find out, and so was every single person on the 42nd floor. 23:15. Claude responded. Linda Marsh slid the folder across the marble table with the practiced grace of a woman who had ended careers for a living. Linda Marsh slid the folder across the marble table with the practiced grace of a woman who had ended careers for a living. Severance agreement. 2 weeks. A non-disparagement clause thick enough to use as a doorstop. A general release of all claims, present and future, known and unknown, against Halberd Capital Partners, its officers, directors, affiliates, and successors. Signed by Monday 9 a.m., and they'd cut a check for $38,000. Don't sign, and they'd explore other options. Richard didn't make eye contact. He looked at the river. Claire, this isn't personal. We're restructuring Treasury. Mark wants a tighter team. You've been a tremendous asset, but the role is evolving in a direction that's not, well, it's not where your strengths are. I said nothing. I let the silence sit there like a third person at the table. Linda filled it the way HR people always do. We'd appreciate it if you could clear your desk tonight. Security will escort you to the lobby. Your access will be revoked at 6 p.m., standard procedure. She smiled the small, surgical smile of a woman, reading a script for the 400th time. I looked at my watch. 5:58 p.m. I had exactly 2 minutes before my badge stopped working. I picked up the folder. I said, I'd like to read this with counsel before I sign anything. Richard's smile tightened by a millimeter. Of course, he said. Of course, take the weekend. I stood up. I walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry in the elevator. I didn't even text my sister back. I walked through the lobby, past Hannah at reception, who didn't look up because somebody had clearly told her not to, and out onto Park Avenue, where a freezing Manhattan wind was doing its weekly imitation of an apology. At 6:02 p.m., my phone vibrated. JPMorgan Chase, Treasury Services. The voice on the other end was a woman I'd been working with for nearly a year on a separate compliance review, Patricia Reyes, VP, Wire Operations. Claire, hi. I'm calling on the Halberd master account. We have a $47 million outbound wire that hit the queue this morning. Counterparty review flagged it. We need your signatory confirmation before release. I stood on the corner of Park and 48th, yellow cabs blurring past, the wind cutting through my blazer like it had a grudge. I took a breath. I said very calmly, Patricia, I'm going to need you to hold that wire. I no longer have signatory authority at Halberd as of 6 p.m. this evening. I'd like to flag that the transaction was presented to me this morning with incomplete counterparty documentation, and I'm not in a position to authorize release. There was a pause on the line that I will remember for the rest of my life. A small, careful silence inside which an entire river of money simply stopped moving. Understood, she said. I'm escalating this to compliance. The wire will remain frozen pending further review. I thanked her. I hung up. I walked 3 blocks south to a coffee shop on 45th, ordered a chamomile tea I had no intention of drinking, and sat down at a corner table facing the door. I opened my laptop. I logged into my personal Gmail. The folder I had forwarded to myself at 9:14 a.m. that morning was sitting at the top of my inbox like a small, polite, explosive device. I didn't open the documents, not yet. Instead, I opened a new message. The address I typed into the recipient line was one I had memorized 11 months earlier, the night I had first noticed a wire to a Delaware shell entity that didn't appear on any approved counterparty list. The night I had decided, quietly, without telling anyone, that I was going to be a person with a paper trail rather than a person with a problem. The address belonged to Daniel Carver, partner at a white shoe firm in Midtown, specialist in SOX Section 806 whistleblower matters. I'd had one introductory call with him in March. He'd told me, in that careful lawyer way, that if I ever needed him, I should email, not call, and use the subject line following up. I typed, following up. I attached nothing. I wrote 2 sentences. I was terminated at 5:45 p.m. today. The transaction we discussed was presented for my signature this morning. I hit send at 6:31 p.m. My phone buzzed again. Not Daniel. Richard. Claire, let's talk. I think we got ahead of ourselves in there. Call me. 30 seconds later, another. Claire, this is time sensitive. Please call. I watched the screen the way you watch a wasp inside a glass. Interested but not moved. At 6:44 p.m., Daniel Carver replied, 2 lines. Don't sign anything. Don't return any calls. I'll see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. my office, 49th and Madison. Bring everything. I closed the laptop. I left the tea. I walked out onto the avenue in the dropping dark, the city's million lit windows climbing up around me, and I thought about how often, in 6 years at Halberd, Richard had stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass in the East River room and said the same sentence to investors. Treasury is just plumbing. It just moves the water. Plumbing has valves. He had forgotten about the valves. I caught a yellow cab on Madison, gave the driver my address in the West Village, and watched Manhattan slide by behind the window. Somewhere on the 42nd floor of a tower I would never enter again, Richard Caldwell was about to discover that a wire he had been counting on to close out his Friday had not moved. And by Monday morning, the people he would have to explain that to would not be sitting in his conference room. They would be sitting in a glass building downtown with 3 letters on the door. But I didn't know yet what was on the USB I'd had in my bag the whole time, or whose name was about to appear on a document I hadn't yet asked Daniel to pull. Tap subscribe if you think Claire should open the folder before Monday at 9 a.m. And tell me in the comments what you'd do in her seat at that coffee shop on 45th. Saturday morning in Manhattan is its own country. The avenues are quieter, the doormen friendlier, the coffee shops full of people who actually have time to read the paper. I walked from my apartment in the West Village up to 49th and Madison, wearing a charcoal theory suit and flat black loafers, carrying a leather tote with 1 external hard drive, 1 USB stick, 1 manila folder, and a printout of every email I had legitimately authored at Halberd Capital Partners in the last 11 months. I had slept 4 hours. I had eaten a piece of toast. I felt, oddly, like a person on her way to her own wedding. Calm, focused, slightly unreal. Daniel Carver's office was on the 28th floor of a limestone tower a block off Park, in the kind of white shoe firm that has a Latin name and a reception desk made of a single piece of stone. He met me in the lobby himself. 50-something, tortoiseshell glasses, the unshowy confidence of a man who had taken a Fortune 500 CFO's deposition before breakfast and would not be impressed by anyone today. He shook my hand, said good morning, and walked me down a corridor of closed doors to a corner conference room where a woman in her late 40s was already setting up 2 laptops. Claire, this is Megan Ashford, my partner. Forensic accounting, SEC enforcement before private practice. She'll be on this with me. I sat down. They sat down. Megan took the hard drive without ceremony. Daniel folded his hands. Walk me through yesterday. Started 8:47 a.m. I did. The blue bottle coffee, the East River room, the folder, the 31 pages of nothing, the blank counterparty box, the Delaware escrow registered 4 months ago, the CFO's mechanical signature, the 9:14 a.m. forwarded packet, the 5:45 p.m. termination, the 6:02 p.m. call from Patricia Reyes at JPMorgan, the frozen wire, the chamomile tea I never drank. Daniel listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said 1 sentence. Claire, I want to be very clear with you about what you did yesterday between 9 a.m. and 9:14 a.m. and what you did at 6:02 p.m. Both of those acts, in this jurisdiction, in this fact pattern, fall within Section 806 of Sarbanes-Oxley. You are a protected whistleblower as of yesterday morning. You did not become one this morning. You became one before Richard Caldwell knew he was going to fire you. I let that sentence land. Outside the window, a pigeon was sitting on the ledge of the building across the street, oblivious. Megan turned her laptop toward me. She had already opened the contents of the hard drive. Claire, this is a lot of material. Tell me what I'm looking at on this folder labeled Hudson Crossing Escrow 0422, I told her. 11 months ago, I had pulled wire records on a $4.2 million transfer from our master treasury account at JPMorgan to a Delaware escrow named Hudson Crossing Holdings, LLC. The escrow agent had no website. The counterparty had no listing on any of our approved vendor schedules. The transaction memo described it as deal expense reimbursement, which is the kind of phrase you write when you don't want to write anything. I had flagged it internally through our compliance portal in a one-line entry. 2 days later, the entry had been closed without explanation by James Whitaker, general counsel. The wire had gone out anyway. I had said nothing. I had started keeping a private journal. In 11 months, there had been 6 more wires to 6 more Delaware entities, all opened within 90 days of the transfer, all routed through the same regional bank in Wilmington, all signed by Mark Donovan as CFO and one of 3 rotating signatories from the executive floor. Total volume, a little over $61 million. The $47 million wire Richard had brought me yesterday would have made it $108 million. Megan stopped scrolling. She looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at me. Claire, he said very quietly, do you understand what this is? I said I had ideas. I said I was a Treasury professional, not a federal prosecutor, and I had been careful not to draw conclusions on paper that I couldn't draw on the witness stand. He nodded slowly. Good. Keep doing that. From this moment forward, you don't theorize. You don't speculate. You report what you saw and what you signed. Megan and I will do the rest. He stood up, walked to a phone on the credenza, and pressed a single button. Helen, can you reach Patricia Reyes at JPMorgan Treasury Services and ask if she would join a call Monday at 8 a.m. and get me the SEC office of the whistleblower line, the direct one, not the public 800. Thank you. He turned back to me. Claire, here's what's going to happen this weekend. You don't speak to anyone at Halberd. You don't return Richard's calls. You don't sign the severance agreement. You do not, under any circumstances, post anything on LinkedIn. You sit in your apartment, you order in, you watch something on television, and on Monday morning at 7:30 a.m., you walk into this building and we begin the process of filing a TCR, a tip, complaint, or referral, with the SEC Office of the Whistleblower under the Dodd-Frank program. We will also be preparing a separate retaliation claim under SOX 806. And on the civil side, given the cap table irregularities you flagged, there may be a shareholder derivative angle, but we'll get to that. I asked the question I had been carrying since 5:45 p.m. Daniel, what happens to the 47 members? He almost smiled. The wire is frozen. JP Morgan's compliance team has already opened a SAR, a suspicious activity report. That's a regulatory obligation, not a courtesy. By Monday morning, that SAR will be on a desk at FinCEN. By Tuesday, it may be on a desk at the SEC's Enforcement Division. Halberd Capital Partners is going to have a very interesting week, Claire, and the most interesting thing about it is that you will not be in the room for any of it. I walked out of that office at 12:14 p.m. I bought a turkey sandwich from a deli on Madison. I ate it sitting on a bench in Bryant Park, watching tourists photograph the lions outside the public library, and I felt my phone vibrate 4 more times in my bag. Richard, Mark, Linda, a number I didn't recognize from a 212 area code. I did not answer any of them. At 4:30 p.m., an email arrived in my personal inbox from an address I had never seen. Claire, this is Andrew Halberd. I understand there's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to invite you to my home in Greenwich tomorrow afternoon for a private conversation, founder to colleague. A car can collect you at 1 p.m. A.H. Andrew Halberd, the founder, the man whose name was on the door, the man who had not, to my knowledge, set foot in the Park Avenue office in 3 years, the man who, according to the cap table I had been quietly studying for 11 months, still personally controlled 41% of the firm's equity and chaired its 3-person investment committee. I forwarded the email to Daniel without a single word of commentary. His reply came back in under 90 seconds, 3 words long. Do not go. But the email itself told me something I hadn't known yesterday at 5:45 p.m., when Richard had been sitting across from me in the East River room with the river going gold behind him. It told me that somewhere on the executive floor of Halberd Capital Partners, somebody had figured out exactly who had stopped the wire. And it told me that the panic on the 42nd floor had already climbed past Richard, past Mark, past James, all the way up to a man in a stone house in Connecticut who hadn't bothered to learn my name in 6 years. I sat on the bench in Bryant Park for a long time. The light was beginning to slant. A child somewhere was laughing. And I realized with a quiet, clean certainty that I had not been the smallest person in this story for almost a year. I had only been the quietest. I did not go to Greenwich. Instead, on Sunday afternoon, while a black SUV was presumably idling outside a townhouse in the West Village, waiting for a woman who was not coming down, I was sitting cross-legged on my living room floor in sweatpants, drinking coffee out of a chipped mug from a conference I'd attended in 2019, organizing 11 months of documents into a chronology that Megan Ashford had asked me to prepare before Monday morning. The radiator ticked. The light through the window went from white to gold to pink to that particular violet that only happens in Manhattan in late October. My phone rang 4 times. I let it. At 6:17 p.m., an email arrived from Andrew Halberd, sent from a personal Gmail rather than his corporate address. The subject line read, "I think we should still talk." The body was 3 paragraphs of careful, lawyered warmth. "I've known your work for some time, Claire. I've always considered you one of our most thoughtful operators. Whatever you believe you've seen, I'd ask you to give the firm one conversation before you make decisions you cannot reverse. No threats, no promises. Just the slow, expensive gravity of a man who was used to being met halfway." I forwarded it to Daniel. He replied, "Save it. Do not engage. See you at 7:30. Monday morning, I walked into Daniel's office at 7:28 a.m. in a Navy Max Mara suit and the same flat black loafers because I had decided that I would not be a woman who bought a new outfit for the worst week of someone else's life. The conference room had been transformed. There were 3 laptops, 2 printers, a whiteboard covered in dates and account numbers, and a quiet young associate named Priya who introduced herself, shook my hand once, and did not speak again for the next 11 hours. At 8 a.m., Daniel placed a call to Patricia Reyes at JPMorgan. The conversation lasted 19 minutes. The 47-millimeter wire was officially classified as a suspended transaction pending counterparty verification. A suspicious activity report had been filed by the bank's compliance unit at 4:46 p.m. on Saturday. JPMorgan does not sleep on weekends when a number has 8 digits on it. The SAR was already in the FinCEN system. Patricia, who had been a compliance officer for 16 years and had never met me in person, said one thing before she hung up that I will keep forever. "Claire, you did the right thing. A lot of people don't." At 8:34 a.m., Daniel filed the TCR with the SEC Office of the Whistleblower. Electronic submission, confirmation number in under a minute. He printed the receipt and slid it across the table to me like a passport. At 9:11 a.m., Megan filed the SOX 806 retaliation complaint with OSHA because that is where SOX retaliation claims actually go, a fact that surprises everyone the first time they hear it, including me. At 9:47 a.m., my phone began to vibrate without stopping. It was Richard, then Mark Donovan, then a number from the Halberd main switchboard, then James Whitaker, General Counsel, then a 203 area code, Connecticut, then Linda Marsh from HR, who left a voicemail in a voice 3 semitones higher than the one she'd used in the East River room on Friday. "Claire, hi, it's Linda. We'd love to revisit our conversation. We may have been hasty. Please call me back at your earliest convenience." I listened to it once. I deleted it. Daniel watched me do it and nodded. At 11:20 a.m., an email arrived in my personal inbox from a Halberd address I knew well, Jessica Tan, Richard's executive assistant, a woman who had brought me a cup of soup once when I'd had the flu in 2022. The email was short. "Claire, I don't know if I should be sending this. There's a meeting on the 42nd floor at 1 p.m. with 2 men from a firm called Latham. Richard told me to cancel all his afternoons through Friday. He hasn't eaten. I just wanted to say, whatever's happening, I'm sorry. Jay." I closed the email. I did not respond. Daniel said very quietly, "Don't reply, but save it. We may need it later." At 12:46 p.m., Megan looked up from her laptop and said the sentence that rearranged the entire weekend in my head. Claire, the Delaware entities. I've been running the formation records. Hudson Crossing Holdings, Cortlandt Reserve LLC, Stuyvesant Bridge Partners, and three of the others. They all share a registered agent at the same address in Wilmington. And the beneficial ownership disclosures filed under the Corporate Transparency Act last quarter, three of them list the same individual. She turned the laptop around. The screen showed a redacted regulatory filing with one name visible at the top. Andrew M. Halberd. Not Richard, not Mark, not James, the founder, the man on the cap table, the man in the stone house in Greenwich, the man who had sent a black SUV to my apartment yesterday afternoon to invite me, founder to colleague, to a private conversation. Daniel exhaled through his nose, the closest thing I'd ever seen him come to a smile. Well, that explains the car. I sat very still for a moment. Outside the conference room window, a window washer's rig was descending the side of the building across the street. Two men in harnesses moving down the glass with the unhurried calm of people who knew exactly where their next handhold was. I watched them for what felt like a long time. I had assumed, since Friday, that the story was about Richard Caldwell, a CEO who had tried to push through a 47-millimeter wire, who had fired the only person on the floor who would have asked the wrong question, who had miscalculated the size of the woman he was eliminating. A clean, small, ugly story. A story that fit on one page. But the wires went back 11 months. And the Delaware entities went back further than that. And the man who had built the firm from a one-room office in 2007, who had stepped back from operations in 2022 to focus on family and philanthropy, who hadn't been in the Park Avenue office in 3 years, that man was the one whose name was on the beneficial ownership forms. Richard had been the door. Andrew had been the room. I asked Daniel the only question that mattered. Did Richard know? Daniel looked at the wall for a long moment. Claire, I don't get to answer that, but the SEC is going to ask it. And the answer is going to determine whether Richard Caldwell spends the next 10 years explaining himself to a federal prosecutor or whether he becomes the most cooperative witness in Lower Manhattan by the end of this week. At 2:09 p.m., Megan's phone rang. A 202 area code, Washington, D.C. She stepped out to take it. She was gone for 22 minutes. When she came back, she sat down, picked up a pen, looked at me, and said, Claire, the SEC Enforcement Division would like to schedule an interview. They're sending 2 attorneys to New York Thursday morning. They want you in a conference room at their regional office at 200 Vesey Street at 9 a.m. I nodded. I drank some water. My hand did not shake. At 4:38 p.m., the front desk of Daniel's firm called up to the conference room. A courier had arrived with a sealed envelope addressed to Claire Bennett, CO Daniel Carver. Daniel had it brought up. He cut it open himself with a small silver letter opener that he kept in his desk for no reason I could imagine. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper, embossed at the top with a family monogram and a handwritten note in fountain pen ink. Ms. Bennett, whatever you have been told a fragment of a longer story. I would consider it a personal kindness if you would meet me alone before you speak with anyone in Washington. There's a great deal I can explain that no document can. A. Halberd. I read it twice. I handed it to Daniel without a word. He read it once. He set it on the table. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before, something closer to respect than to professional concern. Claire, he said, he is afraid of you. I had not, until that moment, fully understood that a man like Andrew Halberd could be afraid of a woman like me. I had spent my career being told, in 1,000 small ways, that I was the librarian, that I was the plumbing, that I was the careful one, the cautious one, the one who flagged things in compliance portals and got quietly overruled by men in better suits. I had built a private journal because nobody had ever asked to see a public one. I looked at the cream-colored paper on the conference table. I looked at the SEC interview confirmation on Megan's laptop. I looked at the window washers who had reached the bottom of the building across the street and were unclipping their harnesses, finished for the day. I said, I'm not meeting him. I'm meeting them on Thursday. Daniel nodded once. Megan reached for her phone. Priya, the silent associate, turned a page in her legal pad. And somewhere in a stone house in Greenwich, Connecticut, with a view of Long Island Sound and a wine cellar that had been profiled in Architectural Digest in 2019, Andrew Halberd was about to learn that the librarian had been keeping notes for 11 months, and that she was not, as it turned out, a person who could be invited halfway. Thursday morning, 200 Vesey Street, the World Financial Center, a glass tower beside the wound where the Twin Towers used to stand. I went through security at 8:41 a.m. with my driver's license and a single black folio under my arm. Daniel was beside me in a charcoal suit. Megan walked half a step behind, carrying the only copy of a binder she would not let out of her sight. We were taken to a conference room on the 17th floor with a long oak table, a pitcher of water nobody drank from, and a view of the Hudson going steel gray in the November light. Two SEC attorneys came in at 8:57 a.m. A woman in her mid-40s named Rachel Pearson, senior enforcement counsel. A younger man named Brian Holloway, staff attorney. They shook our hands. They did not smile, but they were not unkind. Rachel said, "Ms. Bennett, thank you for coming in. We've reviewed the materials your counsel transmitted on Monday. We have questions." I sat down. I answered them. For 4 hours and 17 minutes, I answered every question they asked me. Calmly, without speculation, without embellishment, the way Daniel had spent 2 days preparing me to do. I walked them through the Hudson Crossing wire from April 2024. I walked them through the 6 wires that followed. I walked them through the 47 tomatoes Richard had brought into the East River room on a Friday afternoon with a blue bottle coffee in his hand. I walked them through the private journal, every entry time-stamped, every entry corroborated by an email I had legitimately authored at the time. I did not speculate about Andrew Halberd. I did not need to. The beneficial ownership forms had his name on them already. At 1:14 p.m., Rachel Pearson closed her notebook. She looked at Brian. Brian nodded once. She looked at me. "Ms. Bennett, I want to thank you for the quality of the documentation. In 16 years at this office, I have not seen a tip with this level of contemporaneous record keeping from someone who was not a lawyer. We will be in touch through counsel. I would expect movement within 10 business days." 10 business days in SEC time is a phrase that sounds polite and lands like a freight train. That evening, Friday morning to be precise, I learned later from Patricia Reyes, agents from the SEC and FBI white-collar division served document preservation orders on Halberd Capital Partners at 7:42 a.m., on JPMorgan Chase's Institutional Treasury Group at 7:51 a.m., and on the registered agent in Wilmington that had served 6 Delaware shell entities at 8:03 a.m. By 9:30 a.m., 2 cars I had never seen were parked outside the Greenwich address Andrew Halberd had invited me to the previous Sunday. By 11 a.m., the news desk at the Wall Street Journal had received a tip from someone who was not me, and by 4 p.m. that afternoon, Halberd Capital Partners was a headline on the front page of the website, above a stock photo of the Park Avenue building with the lobby I would never walk through again. Richard Caldwell lasted 6 days as CEO. The board removed him on the following Thursday, citing loss of confidence. Corporate code for "We have read the SAR." James Whitaker, general counsel, resigned the same afternoon and retained his own attorney within the hour. Mark Donovan, CFO, the mechanical signature on every wire, was the one who broke. By the end of the second week, he had walked into 200 Vesey Street with his lawyer and signed a cooperation agreement that would, in time, become the spine of the government's case. Andrew Halberd did not break. Andrew Halberd hired Wachtell. Andrew Halberd's name disappeared from the firm's website on a Tuesday evening at 11:47 p.m., the kind of timing only a crisis communications team in Midtown is willing to execute. The Delaware entities were unwound. The Wilmington Bank ended its relationship with the registered agent. The wires were traced. A grand jury was impaneled in the Southern District of New York in February. The criminal indictment, when it came down in April, named 4 individuals. Andrew M. Halberd was one of them. The charges included securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and a Sarbanes-Oxley count I had only ever read about in compliance memos. Trial was scheduled for the following spring. He did not plead, but the firm did. Halberd Capital Partners entered into a deferred prosecution agreement with the Department of Justice for $94 million, admitted the statement of facts, and committed to an independent compliance monitor for 3 years. I learned most of this the way the rest of the country learned it, from the Wall Street Journal, from Bloomberg, from the SEC's enforcement press release that quoted, by name, a senior Treasury professional who came forward with substantial original information that materially advanced the investigation. My name was not in the release. Daniel had insisted. The whistleblower program does not require public identification, and Daniel had spent a career making sure his clients' names stayed off the wire. The award came on a Tuesday in early summer. Under the Dodd-Frank whistleblower program, an eligible whistleblower can receive between 10 and 30% of monetary sanctions, over $1 million. The total sanctions across the SEC and DOJ actions, by the time the dust settled, were a number I had to read 3 times to believe. My award, after the SEC's calculation and Daniel's contingency, was a wire transfer that landed in my personal Fidelity account on a Wednesday morning in June at 10:04 a.m. I was sitting in a coffee shop on Hudson Street when the alert came through on my phone. I did not gasp. I did not call my sister. I closed the app. I drank my coffee. I watched a woman across the room teach her toddler how to use a straw. The SOX 806 retaliation matter settled separately, quietly, on terms covered by the NDA I am permitted to acknowledge exists but not describe. The non-disparagement clause Linda Marsh had wanted me to sign in the East River room on a Friday at 5:45 p.m. had become, in the end, a clause Halberd Capital Partners signed about me. I did not work in private equity again. I did not need to. Daniel introduced me 6 months later to the chief compliance officer of a long-only asset manager in the financial district, a woman in her 50s named Catherine Yates, who had read about the Halberd matter and had apparently made a quiet phone call. We met for breakfast at a hotel restaurant in Tribeca. She did not mention the case. She offered me a role building out a treasury controls function from scratch, reporting directly to her with a budget and a small team and a mandate to design the kind of system I had spent 6 years wishing Halberd had. I started in September. Sometimes on a clear Friday afternoon, I walk up Park Avenue from my new office, and I pass the building with the glass tower and the lobby I will never enter again. I do not look up. I do not need to. I know which floor the East River room is on. I know the river is still going gold behind that window, 4 days a week, when the weather cooperates. I know somebody else is sitting in the chair where Richard Caldwell sat, and somebody else is doing the work I used to do, and somebody else is being called kid by a man in a better suit. I think often about the moment at 8:47 a.m. on that Friday in October when Richard Caldwell walked up to my desk with 2 coffees from Blue Bottle and a folder under his arm, and I think about how close I came to signing it. Not because I would have, but because the room was built so that I would. The conference table, the river light, the white-toothed smile, the 31 pages of nothing, the CFO's neat mechanical signature already in the box. The words "just need your counter signature, Claire," spoken in a voice that had been practiced on every junior associate in Lower Manhattan for 30 years. Everything in that room had been engineered to make a signature easier than a question. I had asked the question anyway. Not loudly, not bravely, just quietly, the way librarians ask questions. By going back to my desk, opening a private journal, and writing down what I had seen. The plumbing has valves. Richard had forgotten about the valves. Andrew had built the building around the assumption that nobody on the 42nd floor would ever turn one. He had been right about everyone except the woman he hadn't bothered to learn the name of. It was a freezing February morning in Manhattan, more than a year after the East River room, when I walked into the new office on a Wednesday at 7:48 a.m., set my coffee down on a desk that overlooked the harbor, and opened the controls framework I had been building for the last 5 months. Catherine had asked me in her quiet way to present it to the board the following Tuesday. I had said yes. I sat down. I took off my coat. I opened my notebook. And I started the morning the way I had started every morning of my professional life, the only way I knew how. I wrote down the date. I wrote down the time. And I began.